I think we are all very excited to listen to our very distinguished speaker. So I would like to welcome you all to the very first lecture of the Boğaziçi lecture series of this academic year, which I hope will be a peaceful one for the Boğaziçi community. Distinguished guests, dear friends, dear colleagues, dear students, I would like to start my short speech with a quotation from one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century, a quotation that my colleagues from social sciences brought to my attention very recently. And I hope this quotation will reflect of our feelings. Hannah Arendt, in The Human Condition, says the following: plurality is the condition of human action because we are all the same, that is human, in such a way that nobody is ever the same as anyone else who ever lived, lives, or will live. As Arendt suggests here, just as we share the sameness of being human, we at the same time differ from each other on the very same grounds, embracing plurality and singularity at the very same time. For centuries, human societies have lived with this duality, very often full of tensions and conflicts emanating from social difference, inequality, and injustice. As many other thinkers have suggested, the rare instances in history when the social tensions and conflicts have been resolved rather peacefully and for the greater common good were times when freedom and good politics conditioned the public sphere. In that sense, there is a very strong relationship between politics, freedom, and peace. Violence, on the other hand, is the main antidote to all these. Violence destroys the conditions and grounds necessary for people to talk to each other and create consensus of any kind for a better future. Mutual understanding is impossible under conditions of war and violence. As a country, we are living through violence and grief for some time. Hundreds of lives have been ended, destroyed, saddened, and left to misery. Even worse, what we observe is a growing public indifference to the social grief and tragedy. If we do not want our futures to be hijacked by the banality of evil, we need to forcefully remember our sameness as humans and simultaneously recognize the plurality of our conditions. There is no other way out. Today's lecture will give us a head start on the discussion of some of these issues. I am sure it will provide lots of food for thought. Now it's time for me to leave the floor to my colleague, Emine Fişek, to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Saba Mahmood. Thank you for being with us, especially today. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming, first of all. I'm delighted to be here today and to join our rector in welcoming and introducing Professor Saba Mahmood. The goal of the Boğaziçi Lecture Series is to connect the Boğaziçi community to leading academics from around the world, and Professor Mahmood's work has been instrumental to how scholars in anthropology and related disciplines, as well as many who labor in the world beyond academia, think about the relationship between religion and secularism, ethics and politics, and freedom and agency. Yet, our decision to invite Professor Mahmood was motivated by a desire to think through a number of questions that are central to the world that we, the audience, live in today. Questions related to the status and the rights of religious minorities. Rather than focusing on the Turkish context, however, we thought that our thinking would be nourished by looking elsewhere. In many ways, this theme of looking elsewhere, of benefiting from the distance of displacement, has been central to Saba Mahmood's own work. In the 2005 preface to her groundbreaking study, Politics of Piety, the Islamic Revival and the Feminist Subject, Mahmood wrote that to think through what she calls the conundrums, puzzles, and challenges of the growth and support for Islamist movements in her native Pakistan, she had to undertake a series of dislocations, most notably from Pakistan to Egypt, that rendered her own political commitments less certain. Indeed, in Politics of Piety, Mahmood argues that women's involvement in the Islamic revival in Egypt poses a distinct challenge to traditions of feminist theory that grow out of a normative liberal conception of politics. Whereas liberal thought allocates religion to the private space of individual belief, the women's mosque movement studied by Mahmood reveals a different understanding of religiosity. For these women, the cultivation of piety or involvement in ritual practices does not result in familiar forms of identity politics. Likewise, where liberal views of the self think about agency as the willingness to resist constraint, Mahmood forces us to ask if all projects of self-formation or self-realization have to be guided by the same ideal of agency, the same ideal of autonomy. Throughout her analysis of the women's mosque movement in Cairo, Mahmood makes clear that her goal is not to celebrate what she calls one architecture of the self over another, but to show how understanding and historicizing these multiple selves requires that one's own political commitments come under question. In Politics of Piety, and again in her contribution to the volume Is Critique Secular, on the Danish cartoon controversy, Mahmood argues that what she calls this labor of thought is fundamental to one's ability to recognize, even as one remains critical, forms of human flourishing, of human life that are fundamentally different from one's own. This, Mahmood notes in the preface, is not an exercise in generosity. Rather, it grows out of a desire to recognize the limitations posed by one's own potential parochialisms or blind spots. This is the only way, Mahmood argues, for example, to recognize the forms of injury and religiosity that characterized certain pious Muslims' reactions to the publication of the Danish cartoons. Not ultimately to endorse the nature of those reactions, but to recognize that the construction of a multicultural, multi-religious society requires asking a series of difficult questions about concepts that require protection even as they require critical thought, concepts like human rights. The labor of struggling for social injustice, in other words, has to coexist with the labor of thought. As I utter these words, I'm wary of the fact that doing so from within the confines of the university is becoming increasingly more difficult. Saba Mahmood comes to us from the University of California, Berkeley, an institution that once embodied the golden promise of the Californian dream, a public university with a legendary history of social activism. Today, California's public infrastructure is slowly dissolving. And halfway across the world, we too are facing forms of educational privatization whose consequences we are only beginning to comprehend. All the more reason, then, to work to create spaces where we can think about possibilities for collective political action, as a group of students, staff, and faculty did last week when they gathered together to mourn the Ankara massacre of October 10 and tried to learn from one another's reactions to the event. At the same time, all the more reason to create spaces for the labor of thought, spaces for displacement. It is with that goal in mind that we open the Boğaziçi lectures this year and turn to Professor Mahmood to aid us in looking elsewhere. Thank you. And I welcome now Professor Saba Mahmood.
Thank you so much for this very thoughtful and very erudite introduction. It is an immense pleasure and an honor to be here at Boğaziçi University, especially in this moment and this time. And I want to thank both the rector of Boğaziçi University for making this series possible, but I want to particularly thank Emine Fishik for bringing me here. We have a long camaraderie that goes back to UC Berkeley, when I had the privilege of crossing Emine's path, and she was a student there. So it's a great privilege and honor to be in this conversation with her and with all of you today. So let me start, and let me first see if I can balance my computer. Ooh, maybe I did the opposite. Thank you, that's great, okay. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the religious diversity that had characterized the Middle East for centuries is in precipitous decline today. The reasons for this are multiple, including the civil wars that have ravaged Iraq, Syria, and Libya, the territorial expansion of militant Islamist groups like the Islamic State, and the steady erosion of political and civil rights in the region. The US invasion of Iraq and then the subsequent intervention in Libya have left wide swaths of the Middle East in utter disarray and has brought the plight of religious minorities to a new impasse. My talk today is an exploration of the minority question, not so much in the context of warfare, but under conditions of stable governance where the promise of civil and political equality continues to hold sway. Because I'm interested in how religious difference has come to be regulated and remade under secularism, I focus on the problem of religious minorities, rather than groups defined by ethnic, linguistic, or other attributes. In the course of this talk, I will draw upon the case of Coptic Orthodox Christians in Egypt, who constitute the largest Christian minority in the Middle East today. I analyze their case in the context of a broader genealogy of the modern concept of minority rights in international law and the Middle East. My argument in a nutshell is that in the post-colonial period, modern secular governance in the Middle East has exacerbated religious tensions, hardened interfaith boundaries, and polarized religious differences rather than alleviating them. This will seem counterintuitive to those who believe that secularism is a solution to the problem of religious strife rather than a force in its creation. Yet, as I hope to show, we cannot understand religious conflict in the Middle East without adequate attention to how modern secularism has transformed religious identity and interfaith relations. Secularism has an inescapable character that emanates in part from the structure of the modern liberal state, which promises to demolish religious hierarchies in order to create a body politic in which all its members are equal before the law. The secular ideal of religious equality, introduced in the 19th century, transformed relations between Muslims and non-Muslims, making it possible for non-Muslims to imagine a future of civil and political equality. Despite this foundational promise, religious minorities continue to suffer various forms of discrimination in contemporary Middle Eastern societies. While Islamic concepts and practices are crucial to the production of this inequality, I argue that the modern state and its political rationality have played a far more decisive role in transforming pre-existing religious differences, producing new forms of communal polarization, and making religion more rather than less salient to minority and majority identities alike. Two paradoxical features of this secular political rationality are particularly germane. First, its claim to religious neutrality notwithstanding, the modern state has become involved in the regulation and management of religious life to an unprecedented degree, thereby embroiling the state in substantive issues of religious doctrine and practice. Second, despite the commitment to leveling religious differences in the political sphere, modern secular governance transforms and in some instances intensifies pre-existing interfaith inequalities, allowing them to flourish in society and hence for religion to striate national identity and public norms. Following Talal Asad, I conceptualize political secularism as the modern state's sovereign power to reorganize substantive features of religious life, stipulating what religion is or ought to be, assigning its proper content, and disseminating concomitant subjectivities, ethical frameworks, and quotidian practices. The state's sovereign power to define and regulate religious life is neither monolithic nor predetermined. Rather, it is shot through with a generative contradiction. On the one hand, the liberal state claims to maintain a separation between church and state by relegating religion to the private sphere. On the other hand, modern governmentality involves the state's intervention and regulation of many aspects of socio-religious life, dissolving the distinction between public and private, thereby breaching its first claim. This does not mean that the liberal state's ideological commitment to keep religion and state apart is false or specious, or that secularism constrains religion rather than setting it free. Rather, the two propensities internal to secularism, the regulation of religious life and the construction of religion as a space free from state intervention, account for its phenomenal power to regenerate itself. Any incursion of the state into religious life often engenders the demand for keeping religion and state separate, thereby replenishing secularism's normative premise and promise. Consequently, the question of how and where to draw the line between religion and politics, between what is deemed public and what is deemed private, acquires a particular salience in modern polities and is constantly subject to legal and political contestation. So, for example, you have debates in France about the legality of the ban on the headscarf, whether it actually infringes an individual's right to religious liberty, or is it the state's right to preserve the secular culture of the republic. Similarly, endless debates about whether the United States should allow prayer in public school, or what the role of Islam should be in the constitution of Tunisia, for example, or Egypt after the uprisings. As I suggested, the inescapable quality of secularism in part emanates from the structure of the modern liberal state, which promises to demolish pre-modern forms of hierarchy in order to create a polity where all citizens are supposed to be formally equal in the eyes of the law. The promise of religious equality is a transformative and signal feature of secularism. This promise, we might recall, was linked to a foundational critique of ascriptive or primordial inequality and a recalibration of particularistic forms of belonging. The modern political subject had to subordinate fealty to his religion, locale, and clan to loyalty to the nation state. In the 19th century, the liberatory promise of political and civil equality transformed how non-Muslim subjects of Islamic empires came to understand themselves in relationship to the state. No longer destined to remain unequal by virtue of their faith, membership in the modern polity promised to allow them to stand as equals with Muslims. A key dimension of this transformation was the legal and political elaboration of the public and private divide, which was an important source for elaborating other modern distinctions, such as secular versus religious, political versus civil, and universal versus parochial. When Coptic Orthodox Christians in Egypt at the turn of the 20th century tried to find themselves in this abstract language of citizenship, their Christianity posed fundamental, if familiar, problems. Their enfranchisement was predicated upon their willingness to privatize their Christianity, precisely because their religious difference was deemed to be inconsequential to their public, political, and legal status. This circumscription of Coptic Christianity to the private domain went hand in hand with the enshrinement of Islam as the collective identity of the nation. Despite the citizenry's diverse allegiances, all Egyptians were expected to recognize Islam as essential to the formation of the nation in a way that other religions were not. When the first Egyptian constitution was being forged in the 1920s, Coptic Christians struggled with this condition of their political enfranchisement. Despite protestations, Coptic representatives decided to accept this wager at the time, encapsulated in the legendary statement made by Makram Abeid, a prominent Coptic leader, that he was a Muslim by country and a Christian by religion, the former public and the latter private. This earlier moment in the making of the Egyptian nation is often read as a tragic gamble that the Copts lost to Islamic forces who hijacked the promise of equal citizenship. Yet, it behooves us to think critically about the structural challenges Coptic Christians faced, not unlike other religious minorities in the framework of the nation state. The parallel with the Jewish question in Europe is instructive here. As historians of Europe tell us, Jewish emancipation over the long 19th century was predicated upon the privatization and individualization of Jewish religious life. This often entailed both the dissolution of their autonomy over various aspects of communal life and their assimilation into the cultural norms of European nations rooted in Christian values and sensibilities. Despite Jewish attempts to accommodate this demand, their difference from the identity of the nation did not simply disappear. The persistence of the Jewish question well into the 20th century indicates that Jewish difference, particularly embodied in the practices and lifestyles of the unassimilated Jews, could not be successfully abstracted. It continued to pose a challenge to the norms of European nations, which were supposedly universal and irreligious, but substantively Christian. The invention of the concept of national minority and the minority rights regime instituted under the League of Nations during the interwar period were meant to recognize and redress the assimilative force of nationalist politics directed against European Jews and other groups whose religious, ethnic, and linguistic profile rendered them vulnerable. Now, the fate of non-Muslim minorities in the broader Middle East cannot be traced without talking about the Ottoman Empire and its lasting legacy in shaping the contours of the modern Middle East. As you well know, the status of non-Muslims under Ottoman rule varied widely because of the empire's sheer territorial scope and long duration. Historians, however, have tried to describe key features of Ottoman rule in regard to the status of non-Muslims. A striking feature of Ottoman rule was that it did not aim to politically transform difference into sameness, but allowed diverse religious communities to exist contiguously within a system where Muslims occupied the highest status. Thus, unlike Christian empires that forced non-believers to convert in order to save their souls, this was not a part of Ottoman imperial policy. This distinctive feature of Ottoman rule has led one scholar to characterize it as the empire of difference. Under the Pact of Dhimma, non-Muslims were accorded state protection and the right to practice their religion, maintain their places of worship, and have communal courts as long as they recognize the supremacy and primacy of Islam. Christian and Jews, as people of the book, had special status in comparison to non-Muslims who did not belong to the Abrahamic faiths. As Anwar Eman puts it, the Pact of Dhimma was a legal instrument for the political inclusion of non-Muslims into the empire, as much as an expression of their lower doctrinal and legal status. It is often assumed that the introduction of the discourse of minority rights and religious equality helped religious minorities, particularly Christians and Jews of the empire, to free themselves of Muslim Ottoman tutelage. Yet, this story is far more complex than such a progressive narrative allows. The early history of the concept of minority rights suggests that it is better understood as a technology of modern statecraft and an emergent geopolitical order characterized by the inequality between Western and non-Western forms of sovereignty. Consider, for example, the fact that the discourse of minority rights was first introduced into the Ottoman territories by Western Christian empires as a tool to dismantle Ottoman sovereignty by claiming patronage over Ottoman Christians. As far back as the 16th century, Ottoman rulers had granted special privileges known as capitulations to Western European traders. which allowed them a considerable degree of self-government in matters of criminal and civil jurisdiction, as well as freedom of religion and worship. The capitulations were originally bestowed at a time when the Ottoman Empire was economically and politically strong. But once the balance of power shifted, the capitulations became a potent means in the hands of Western states to further their strategic advantage, which the weakened empire was unable to resist. Within this framework, the capitulary privileges came to apply not only to European traders, but also European missionaries, and later to indigenous Ottoman Christian communities as well, who were placed under the protection of European Christian rulers. Notably, no such parallel privileges existed for Ottomans in relation to non-Christian subjects of European empires. As the 19th century progressed and the Ottoman Empire started to lose large portions of its Christian-dominated territories to breakaway states, European powers played a crucial role in the destruction of the empire by deploying minority rights and religious liberty discourse to expedite the solution and secure their geopolitical interests in the region. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1856, and the Treaty of Berlin, signed in 1878, both contained religious liberty provisions for non-Muslims, which the Ottomans and the newly independent states were forced to adopt under European pressure. None of these breakaway states had the political power to negotiate similar terms from Europe. According to the historian Selim Derengel, at the end of the 19th century, the Ottomans, quote, operated under severe constraints, the main constraint being the claim of great powers to be the protectors of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. This claim made the representatives of the great powers major actors in the domestic affairs of the Ottoman state, end of quote. International law, initially created to uphold a political order grounded in the principle of mutual respect for state sovereignty, authorized European violations of Ottoman sovereignty. 19th century European jurists decided to exclude the Ottoman state from membership in the Society of Nations on the grounds that it was an uncivilized and barbaric polity, most clearly evidenced by the Ottoman mistreatment of its Christian subjects. This was part of a broader European policy that excluded most, if not all, non-Western states from the ambit of international law. Prominent secular jurists of the time advocated European interventions on behalf of Ottoman Christians throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, based on the argument that the principle of non-intervention applied only to European affairs and not to the Ottoman state, because it did not qualify as a member of the community of civilized nations. It is important to note at this point that even as international law became secular in its language, rationale, and stipulations, it also came to root itself in Europe's unique Christian heritage, understood to be unparalleled in its humanism, especially when measured against the barbarity of Islam. Thus, key legal and political figures argued that even though European humanitarian interventions had been secularized since they were undertaken first at the time of Crusades, Christian solidarity was so strong among Europeans that the law of humanity had to accommodate the old Christian ideal. It was this sentiment of Christian fraternity that reinvigorated European support for Christian missionaries around the world in the mid-19th century, even as the West came to understand itself as resolutely secular. Thus, just as France was issuing a full-throated call to laïcité in the 1840s, it witnessed a Catholic revival that reignited popular French zeal to establish new missions in the Middle East. Similarly, the United States and Britain at the time were undergoing their own Protestant awakening, which led to an expansion of Anglican and Presbyterian missions in the region. Due to a complex set of reasons, in 1856, the Ottomans passed the sweeping Hatt-i Humayun decree that dismantled distinctions based on religion, language, and race, as well as forms of legal hierarchy, granting non-Muslims full civil and political rights. Historians argue that such measures were not simply politically expedient ways for the Ottomans to yield to European pressure. Rather, they were the crucial means for consolidating an increasingly fragmented polity and modernizing the state. The struggle between the crumbling Ottoman center and its dissenting Christian subjects did not, of course, end after the passage of Khat-e Humayun, but intensified, as was evident in a series of massacres of Christians that happened in Mount Lebanon and Syria in 1860, in Crete between 1866 and 1896, and of course in Armenia between 1894 and 96. The European press and government widely represented this conflict as an object lesson in the essential barbarity of the Ottomans, using their mistreatment of Christians as an excuse to stage humanitarian interventions on behalf of Christians and further truncating Ottoman territories. For the religious minorities in the empire, while the passage of Khat-e Humayun did not secure all the privileges they had hoped for, the discourse of minority rights and religious freedom became one of the central idioms through which to imagine a future free of servitude to Ottoman Muslim rule. What I want to point out is that by the end of the 19th century, the discourse of minority rights had become an integral part of the political vocabulary through which Muslims and non-Muslims came to perceive and measure their interfaith relations. Even though different actors prescribed different meanings to the term minority, it provided the natural ground for contesting and making certain claims in the national and transnational geopolitical space against one's adversaries and with one's allies. The Versailles Peace Conference in 1919 is narrated as a transformative moment in world history, with the dissolution of empires, the Ottoman, Habsburgs, and Hohenzollern empires that lost World War I. And it heralded the creation of a new international order based on the nation state. While that institutional form was already prevalent in Western Europe and North America, the victorious powers extended nation state status to those that had broken away from the fallen empires. This privilege was denied, of course, as you may remember, to large parts of the world that were deemed unworthy of self-rule and thus brought under direct or indirect forms of colonial rule. But for the estimated 60 million people who were granted a state of their own in Central and Eastern Europe, this was a momentous development. Despite this new international order, the Versailles peace treaties repeated the old patterns, whereby the Allied powers' recognition of the newly independent states was conditioned upon a pledge to uphold the rights of religious and ethnic minorities within their own boundaries. As was the case with earlier treaties, none of the victorious Western powers, Britain, the United States, Italy, France, and Belgium, accepted similar provisions regarding their own minorities. The Welsh and Irish in Britain, Native Americans and blacks in the United States, the Bretons and Basques in France, and the multinational Tyrol in Italy. Despite having lost the war, Germany was not subject to these conditions because of the trust Western Europeans placed in their own capacity for tolerance. Once the horror of the Holocaust unfolded almost 2 decades later, the irony of this judgment was not lost on those forced to accept minority stipulations in 1919. The establishment of the nation state as the dominant political form put into play a new rationale of governance that divided up the governed differently than did the empires. Instead of recognizing parallel and contiguous communities distinct by virtue of their confessional, denominational, or tribal affiliation, the nation state sought to represent the people, united by a shared history, culture, and territory. In this system, each individual qua citizen came to be tied to the state through a system of rights and obligations. The terms majority and minority became a constitutional device for resolving differences that the ideology of nationalism sought to either assimilate or eliminate. Since the Versailles Peace Conference, international law has used the concept of national minority to distinguish communities that can lay claim to membership in a national polity from populations that cannot, such as migrant workers or refugees. Since 1919, minority has come to connote an internationally sanctioned and politically consolidated category whose primary reference is to the nation state in which the minority holds citizenship, rather than the group to whom she or he denominationally or ethnically belonged. Notably, the new nomenclature of minority came to encompass not only religious, but also racial, linguistic, ethnic, and cultural differences. The concept of national minority is built, however, on a fundamental tension. On the one hand, it signifies the membership of a minority group in a national polity. On the other hand, the minority group also represents an incipient threat to national unity by virtue of its difference from the majority. This threat is intrinsic to the ideology of nationalism, because the modern concept of nationhood regards linguistic, ethnic, and cultural characteristics as a legitimate basis for people's claim to self-determination and independent statehood. Under the auspices of the League of Nations, the minority treaties were instituted precisely to regulate this dual character of national minorities, so that we didn't have a proliferation for demand for secessionist states all over the world, which is primarily was the initial charge of the League of Nations through the minority treaties system. Since the end of the Second World War, most international jurists argue that the designation minority encompasses two distinct dimensions: an objective presence of certain racial, ethnic, religious, or linguistic markers that make a group distinct from the majority population, and a subjective dimension that entails a self-recognition on the part of the minority group that they suffer from discrimination as a result of these characteristics. Minority, therefore, is a political term, and not just simply a demographic category, as we tend to think. And because it's a political term, it registers hierarchicalized difference and not simply difference, and is, in a sense, an implicit acknowledgement of the presence of discrimination within a polity against its own citizenry. Despite such attempts to secure an authoritative definition of the term minority in international law, difficult questions persist. Do Native Americans, for example, qualify as a minority, given that they face collective discrimination based on certain shared genealogical, linguistic, and tribal affiliations and distinctions? Similarly, do immigrants coming to Europe and America from former colonies who have gained citizenship status qualify as a national minority if they face discrimination based on their ethnic, racial, or religious identity? Do groups that suffer from discrimination but do not self-identify as a minority qualify for minority rights? Answers to these questions depend not on clear definitions, but on whether sovereign nation states are willing to recognize the existence of minorities and grant them rights and liberties akin to the majority populace. This, in turn, often depends on how national belonging is defined, and whether the definition is rooted in metaphors of blood, kinship, culture, or nature. International bodies like the United Nations may force the so-called weak states to adopt minority rights, but are completely helpless when it comes to convincing Western powers like Germany, France, Britain, and the United States to adopt this. France, which has co-authored all the major international treaties since the 18th century involving minorities, continues to insist that no population living within its borders fits the description of the term as stated in the International Conventions on Civil and Political Rights to this day. Now, the history that I have presented here of minority rights is often read as geopolitical powers cynically manipulating otherwise noble principles in service of realpolitik, or as the misuse of the virtue of tolerance that Western Europeans discovered for themselves and then slowly introduced to less enlightened cultures, sometimes through imperial force and sometimes through soft power such as international diplomacy. Seen in this way, the principle itself, its logic, its aim, and its substantive meaning remains unsullied by the impious intentions of the empires and states that sought to either promote it or subvert it. This manner of thinking needs to be taught urgently for two reasons. First, it is important to understand that when Western Europeans forced weaker states to recognize minority rights, they were not simply bringing their culture of tolerance to non-Western peoples and lands. If this were so, the European powers would have accepted similar provisions for their own minorities, which they have refused to do throughout history. As my talk shows, the discourse of minority rights has been tied from its very inception to raison d'etat, regional and national security, and geopolitics. Rather than see it as a universally applicable moral principle or simply a human right, it is best understood as a strategy of secular liberal governance aimed at regulating and managing difference that is either racial, ethnic, religious, or cultural within a national polity. Seen from this perspective, minority rights does not signify a single essence or meaning. It has changed historically, in large part determined by the context of power relations within which it is inserted. Second, it is also wrong to assume that the concept of minority rights is a neutral legal instrument that protects certain groups from social inequality and discrimination. People who are supposed to benefit from this protection are also transformed by virtue of their subjection to the calculus of state and geopolitical power in unique and unpredictable ways. For example, recognizing a group as a minority transforms its self-understanding, its relationship to other religious communities and the state, and its standing in the eyes of the law. The discourse of minority rights is also an important marker of secularism's inability to eradicate religious differences and hierarchies from the political life of its citizenry. The demand for minority rights brings the issue of difference back into the abstract and disembodied language of citizenship. Minority rights movements emerge when the majoritarian construction of the nation fails to incorporate its others. In this sense, the demand for minority rights is symptomatic of the inequalities that permeate the social life of a polity, an inequality that calls into question the undelivered promise of civil and political equality. So in order to fully elaborate the transformative and paradoxical power of the discourse of minority rights and the larger secular political rationality of which it is a part, let me now turn to the contested nature of its deployment among Coptic Orthodox Christians in Egypt. Coptic Christians are distinct from other Christian communities of the Middle East in that they are known to have shunned offers of European patronage both in the Ottoman period and later in the 20th century when the British offered special protections to Copts as a minority. So basically the British said that if we can become your protectors, then you don't really have to wager your political capital on the construction of a new independent state, a post-colonial state. So the understanding was that if British became the protectors of the Coptic Christians, then they would continue to have an interest in the running of the country of Egypt, even in the post-colonial period. But of course, the Coptic Christians declined this protection and said that they were just as much of Egyptians as were the Muslims, and they were just as anti-colonial as the Egyptian Muslims were. The reasons for this rejection are complex, including a long-standing schism since the 5th century that divided Oriental Orthodox Christianity, of which the Coptic Church is a part, and Western Christendom, which of course included the Byzantine Church. During the course of modern history, Western Christendom has continued to view the Copts as backward and ignorant people, a view upheld not only by European missionaries, but also important Orientalists like Edward Lane and colonial administrators such as Lord Cromer. During the 19th century, Coptic relations with Western Christendom went through a new set of tensions, with fresh incursions of Protestant missions, initially sent from Europe, Anglican, Episcopalian, and Lutheran, and later the United States, primarily Presbyterian. Since none of these had success with Muslim converts, they concentrated their energies on the Copts, competing with the Coptic Orthodox Church for their flock. As a result of this history, Copts have tended to regard the designation minority with deep suspicion as a Western ploy to recruit Coptic Christians to their own ends. In the post-colonial period, however, this earlier attitude toward the term minority has come to be rethought. Despite the leading role Copts had played in the anti-colonial movement, the new nation has not delivered on the promise of civil and political equality. Starting with the regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the first president of Egypt, Copts have found themselves increasingly treated as second-class citizens and marginalized from the administrative and political centers of power. Nasser's authoritarian and despotic tendencies led him to break up the autonomy and power of secular lay Copts, instead strengthening the authority of the centralized church that Nasser could more easily manipulate. One consequence of enshrining the church as the sole representative of Copts in Egypt has been that religious affiliation has become the Copts' main marker, not their citizenship. After Nasser's death in 1970, many of the trends he institutionalized have been reinforced under the three subsequent regimes, with the result that the diacritics of religious difference have become indelibly lodged within the problematic of citizenship. Since 1952, Egyptian civil and political life has been confessionalized to such an extent that it is impossible for most Egyptians to think about what it means to be a citizen outside the context of their religious affiliation. One of the most disturbing consequences of this polarization of religious identity in Egypt is the gradual increase in sectarian violence over the last 10 years. The fact that Muslim perpetrators of violence go unprotected and the Christian victims are denied adequate state protection further reinforces the impression that state agencies are deeply implicated. It is within this double-edged context of the confessionalization of Egyptian civic public life and the increase in interreligious violence that many Copts have come to question their community's earlier rejection of the term minority as a form of self-identity. For these Coptic thinkers and activists, the only way to secure government recognition of and response to Coptic grievances is to adopt the international language of minority rights. Magdi Khalil, for example, is a prominent Coptic activist who strongly endorses the use of the term religious minority for Copts, which he argues not only objectively describes their demographic status, but lays bare a history of religious discrimination that can only be redressed through recourse to international laws that are ultimately supra-sovereign over the Egyptian state itself. Khalil has also issued calls in the past for aggressive foreign intervention on behalf of Copts, including the use of international law and US government action. I mean, as you all know, Egypt is the second largest recipient of US aid. In contrast to Khalil, there are other Coptic thinkers, such as Samir Murqus, a prominent Coptic figure in Egyptian intellectual and public life, who has a long history of nationalist activism. In a series of books and articles, Murqus has challenged the linkage Copts and Muslims tend to draw between the realization of political equality for Copts and their designation as minority. Specifically addressing activists like Magdi Khalil, he argues, they believe that they are bringing Egyptian consciousness to a new level that is not encompassed by the framework of national community. In this, they want to present Muslims and Copts as a majority versus a minority, rather than citizens of the Egyptian nation. There is a fundamental contradiction between the two. The concept of minority emanates from a divisive and fractious principle, whereas citizenship emanates from the principle of equality in rights and responsibilities and participation in the creation and adoption of decisions at all levels for all citizens, irrespective of their differences. End of quote. These two positions, exemplified by Khalil and Murqus, define the parameters of public debate about minority rights in Egypt today. It would be a mistake to understand these two positions as peculiar to Egyptian history. Rather, they exemplify the structural tensions internal to the conceptual and institutional artifice of minority rights, particularly the inequality between first and third world sovereignty. As I've shown, the discourse of minority rights in the Middle East is historically intertwined with conditions of geopolitical inequality, an inequality that has been perpetuated earlier in the 20th century by colonial rule and later by supranational political forms such as the international finance institutions, the United Nations, and all these wonderful international bodies we have in the world today, giving us such a peaceful world. Given this historical imbrication, arguments such as Magdi Khalil's that call on Western powers and international institutions to intervene on behalf of Copts cannot be understood as colonial in any simple sense, in so much as these arguments presuppose and reflect the historical reality of minority rights in the Middle East. Khalil implicitly recognizes this history and the institutional conditions necessary for securing minority rights, particularly for Christian minorities in Egypt. For Copts, such as Murqus, the history of geopolitical inequality between the Middle East and Western power is equally relevant and serves as a starting point for any reflection on the status of Copts as a minority. Unlike Khalil, however, Murqus concludes that in so much as the principle of minority rights was the vehicle for the subjugation of national sovereignty to foreign rule, it cannot serve as the instrument for Coptic salvation. Any embrace of this principle necessarily entails the inscription of Copts in this long-standing colonial project. While we may be tempted to side with one position over the other, it is impossible to deny the imbrication of both in the paradox that haunts the discourse of minority rights globally as well as in post-colonial Middle East. In conclusion, let me paraphrase two key points that I have tried to make in this talk. First, note that for a religious minority to call for international protection in the context of post-colonial societies is also to draw attention to the uniqueness of the group as distinct from the majoritarian identity of the nation. While this operation enhances and articulates fractures within the identity of the nation, it also sets up an unstable synergy between the security afforded by the extension of foreign or international protection to the minority and the insecurity this protection engenders with respect to the minority's relationship to the nation. In other words, the fact that certain post-colonial religious minorities can claim international law to protect themselves from discrimination, and not all religious minorities can, this protection also becomes a source of their vulnerability in relationship to the nation. Their condition of empowerment is also the condition of their vulnerability in regard to the nationalist project. Second, in this talk, I have argued that the secular state's promise to grant its citizenry equal civil and political status, regardless of their religious beliefs, sits in tension with its tendency to enshrine majoritarian religious values in the social and legal norms of the nation. This is equally true of stridently secular states, such as France, that continues to provide exceptions to Catholics, and now, of course, Jews since the Holocaust, as it is true of Egypt that grants Islam a special national status. The difference in their respective political cultures should not blind us to see the similarity. Given this situation, the question is, how can the secular state be called upon to solve the majority-minority conflict when it is partly responsible for its creation? Yet secularism's claim that it is the best solution to religious strife continues to hold sway. Despite the erosion of political and civil equality in Egypt, activists continue to call upon the state to make good on its secular mandate. This not only shows how state sovereignty has become the defining feature and a constraining feature of our political imagination, but more importantly, it also re-entrenches the state's power, its prerogative to act as the arbiter of interreligious relations embedding it further in the domains of religious life. The circularity of this paradox is not unique to Egypt, I want to suggest, but a defining feature of our secular age. Thank you.
Well, I mean, since nobody is venturing forth, I thought I could dive in. It's not exactly well thought out. First, I'd like to thank you very much for this very fresh and inspiring interpretation. I just want to ask. I mean, okay. I mean, your what you do with secularism reminds me of what Kimdika does with nationalism. I sort of see some parallels. I mean, the kind of focus on structural roots of the problem. But are we? I mean, I'm still questioning, though. I mean, are we idealizing the alternative, the religious, religious context being better than a secular context in accommodating some kind of equality or rights to these minority groups? I mean, isn't there, I understand what you say about the structural problems of the secularism, secular states being, using secularism to reify itself. But, isn't this the same with the alternative? I mean, because, in a religious context, like in the Ottoman Empire, clearly, I mean, which one is better? I don't know, because I tend to think that there might be secular, structural problems with religious settings where minorities existed. After all, minorities in the Ottoman Empire were defined with, various exclusions, various restrictions of rights of the religious state. I mean, they were second-class citizens, and totally left.
Well, that's exactly what I said in my talk, that they were second-class citizens. I said that they had to accept the superiority of Islam and did not have the same opportunities. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
All of them is not.
So they're as bad as one another. What's the, in the secular context,
so may I answer?
There is at least some prospect of change, more easy. Isn't there some prospect of, recourse to rights through, an aspiration for universal values, for example, let's say. Again, that might be an ideal too. I mean, things did change, like in the Turkish context, that status of the minorities changed a lot during the Republic. So I don't know, I'd like to...
So first of all, I think that's precisely the problem. As soon as I give this talk, there is a... and this is my reaction too. So it's been a very difficult project for me to write because I am working against my own tendencies. So I identify the problem here as a very intimate problem, that I know that as soon as you start to analytically take apart the violence that's internal to secularism, our gut level is to say, oh my God, this is all we have. If we let this go, what do we have? Are we then really turning to what? Those fanatics who are controlling religious states and making what is our alternative? And I just want to calm that energy down. I want to calm it in myself. I want to calm it in my audience. And the reason is that, first of all, I'm not proposing, therefore, a religious state is a better state, or that Ottoman past was a golden past, which we should actually embrace again. It's absurd to argue those things. I mean, nobody in their right mind can argue that, and I hope you understand that I wouldn't be arguing that. Okay, so we've got that off the table. Good. But having done that, let's go back to what this project is trying to do. It's not simply a structural problem, it's also a practical problem, as you yourself are witnessing in Turkey today in relationship to the Kurdish issue. These are not just structural and ideological problems. They are problems that actually permeate our life and they actually make the ideal of coming together as a country, as a nation, impossible. So we have to, in this moment, try to open up the conceptual space to think about that the very ideals that brought us anti-colonialism, that brought us popular sovereignty, that brought us some semblance of a sort of universal values, the promise of religious equality, and so on, that those very ideals and the institutional forms and material practices that went with that also have an underbelly. And even if we are committed to preserving this system, we have to understand the very forces that are cheek by jowl, internally, conceptually, integrally related. The underbelly is equally related to the most positive visions that this imagination produced, this political horizon produced. And we have to look at that very, very honestly, which means taking apart the things that we hold most dear to see how what we consider to be a progressive, hopeful future was not realized. And it wasn't just simply the crazy factions that hijacked that promise, but it was the very fundamental problems within the model itself. Now, so in order to do that, we have to revisit history. And I feel like my generation, like the young people sitting in this room, we are at a point where we understand that the political horizon of abstract equality, the political horizon of a socialist revolution, it's no longer possible. Both of them have profound problems that come with it. But we are paralyzed by this danger that were we to take this apart, what else do we have? But nobody is asking you to take this apart. What is being asked is, how do we critically rethink the very air we breathe in order to imagine a different future for our children and their children? And that requires reckoning with history and reckoning with the very forces that made our progressive left liberal imaginary possible. And so that's, in a nutshell, is my project here. So yes, we will have to ask uncomfortable questions. Now, to say that what I'm offering is I'm somehow implicitly slipping in a religious state and making it seem it is better, I haven't done that. And I would, in fact, go further. I would say that the Islamists who are trying to seize the state as a means of realizing a religious polity are actually share the exact political imaginary as the hardcore fundamentalist secularists do. The fault lies in precisely thinking that by taking the nationalism and the nation state as the political form, you can actually engineer a society through sheer force. And they are just as much indebted to this nationalist imaginary that I have just outlined as are the secularists. So I don't think creating a religious state in any way gets us out of the impasse. We have to think differently.
Professor Mahmood, I'd like to ask you a very simple question. Is there no secularism outside of the state?
Of course there is. And so I am talking about, I made it very clear, I'm talking about political secularism. And there is the...
Again,
Sure, of course.
There could also be political secularisms that are swelling from the bottom up.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me, there was a part of my talk which I did not read because I was more interested in this kind of back and forth question and answer. The field of critical secular studies, which I am a part of that debate, which is the literature that I'm referring to here, which has really tried to complicate the idea of secularism as simply the separation of church and state. This recent literature argues that secularism, the force and the power of secularism cannot simply be grasped by saying it is merely the separation of church and state. It is a lot more than that. It is, and there is a distinction that is made between secularism as a political doctrine and secularity as a set of ethical practices, as a certain kind of an imagination, as a certain set of cultural practices, interpretive practices, and so on and so forth, which don't necessarily belong to the ambit of the state, but often presume the intelligibility of national sovereignty as the condition for their flourishing. But that doesn't mean their optics is that of the state. In this particular paper that I gave, I was talking about political secularism. But I think your question still stands as to whether it is possible to have a secular imagination that does not take the vantage point of the state as a means to imagine different sets of relationships between different groups across differences, across ethnic differences, religious differences, racial differences. And I would say absolutely. And I think that is precisely what the resources are with which we have to think. Let me give you an example. The Jewish question in Europe, was the anti-Semitism of Europe was not just simply was not eradicated through the force of law alone. There was a fundamental shift in the sensibilities of majoritarian sensibilities of Christian Europeans in the way they came to understand what their relationship of responsibility, accountability should be to the Jewish minority. That shift was not simply an artifact or a direct product of laws that came to ban anti-Semitism, although law clearly played its role. Similarly, towards African Americans in the United States, yes, the civil rights movement was crucial in instituting laws that actually made Jim Crow impossible. Absolutely fundamental. But at the same time, the movement, the black rights movement, such as the Black is Beautiful movement or the cultural movement, which started on both sides, was very instrumental for shaping and changing the sensibilities of the white upper classes and middle classes. Now, to call it simply secular is one way to go. But I do think that forms of coexistence and mutual respect existed before us moderns came along. We tend to think that it's only under secular modernity we suddenly became tolerant. I do not agree with that assessment. I think throughout history you find very different models. The Ottomans were not an example of that. But there were many different models of coexistence. So yes, you can draw upon secularity, but I think it has to be in conversation of ways of inhabiting difference, hierarchical difference, not just people that I can.
Then can I ask a very, again, a very quick follow-up question? When you look at the Middle East and also North Africa, basically Muslim majority societies, do you see any seeds of hope, such as the ones that you've mentioned with regard to anti-Semitism in Europe, or the North American experience that you mentioned?
Yes, absolutely I do. I absolutely do, and I will give you a very recent example of that, and that was in what folded in the Tahrir Square in Egypt. It was unprecedented what happened. And of course, this was squashed down. It was killed by a dictatorship, by a military dictatorship, and of course, also by the foolhardiness of the Muslim Brotherhood in contesting elections and thinking they had a chance for survival. And then their follies and mistakes that they committed. But at the same time, what unfolded during those months, I don't want to romanticize it, but I visited many different times, and it was a very different moment of cooperation and coexistence, where the stakes were very different. The stakes were, yes, you had to displace the dictator, but the stakes were also to create a place of togetherness that did not just presume that it was therefore going to take the reins of power. It was to displace power, but it was not, there was no single political party that dominated in that space. And that was, I mean, I often, when I was there, I thought of Arendt's ruminations on the character of freedom, which he always characterized as an open-ended political horizon and activity. Tunisia is another example, by the way.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk and responses so far. Speaking of hope, even though you did promote, or rather accentuated, the importance of practice or performance, I have a conceptual question, if I may, because I happened to have a chance to discuss this just a few days ago with Judith Butler. And knowing your collaboration, I was wondering, in terms of the political imaginary, what would your take on would be on negative dialectics?
Negative dialectics?
Yeah. I mean, sorry, but I feel like you do have an answer. I would really like to hear your own point.
Well,
rather than Adorno, she was kind of inclined towards Kleinian negative dialectics. So I just wanted to hear your own perspective.
I'm surprised that Judith is doing that these days.
Well, that was psychoanalysis and the other.
It was psychoanalysis,
Harvard.
Yes.
So.
I am not as indebted to the psychoanalytic tradition as Judith is in thinking about politics, and I think that's a very major difference between us, which is what allows for a fruitful collaboration. We come from very different genealogies, analytical and political genealogies. What I would say is that for me that would be too close-ended to actually place the possibility of hope in negative dialectics. It's true, it's enclosed within a certain set of presuppositions that I find very constraining. And I'm not sure that it is a model that carries through and across histories and political contexts. So hence our disagreement.
Hi, I'm Ahmed Fahmi, I'm Egyptian. And the talk was very, very interesting for me. And I would like to ask you two questions, a question and a comment. First, how do you see the papal institution in Egypt?
The what?
The Pope.
The papal institution.
Or the Coptic Orthodox papacy in Egypt. What role did it have in creating this minority situation? And how much did it create more minorities within the Christian? Because the Orthodox papacy totally ignored the existence of any other sect except it. And it actually liked its status as the second minority rather than being one of the like the Catholic Orthodox, the Coptic Catholic papacy. This is one thing. And the other thing is that the comment is that as much as Tahrir represented hope for me, it was also a major disappointment.
It was also?
A major disappointment for me.
Yeah.
Is that I didn't realize this till I came here and saw Gezi Park and studied Hannah Arendt afterwards. Is that when I was in Tahrir, I always felt that there was something missing. I was 18 back then, but like I always felt that there was something missing. Is that, first of all, people didn't represent themselves in the square. People represented themselves as Egyptians first, and then whatever their identity is second. There was no LGBT movement visible. There was no Christian movement visible. There was, I mean, the rule was that let's put difference aside now. We have to kick off the president. Let's create dialogue in the square. Dialogue was present in the square, but it wasn't a visible dialogue. It wasn't a visible representation as much as it was here in Gezi Park. And it's not, when I read Hannah Arendt, it wasn't this ideal of plurality, but rather the ideal of first, we're all Egyptians first, and then our identities second. That we're all equal in being Egyptian and having the same identity, but we didn't, actually. And we didn't try to create this new identity of us being something different. This is how I saw Tahrir Square. I mean, I didn't feel my identity there. I didn't feel represented.
Right. I did not mean to suggest that Tahrir is the only example and the ideal to which we should strive for. The question was, do you see any signs of hope? And so I said, yes, Tahrir was a sign of hope. And so was Gezi, and so was what happened in multiple countries, including the...
Ideal, so far from ideal, but the thing is, whenever I think of Tahrir, that it represented for me a place for a new Egypt where plurality might exist, no, this wasn't the case.
I completely agree with you. There's a lot that could be desired in all of these demonstrations. The question that was posed to me was, do I see any signs of hope? And if we do not actually have any hope, then it makes a future impossible. We are creatures of hope. And we have to look at what has happened in the recent past to be able to break from the longer past to imagine a different future. And if we don't, precisely because of the kinds of things you're saying, there's something to critique there. It's not the Mubarak regime, it's not the Sisi regime. And that makes possible to imagine a different future. And it's not perfection, and it's not going to deliver everything, but if it was not for this kinds of changes, imagine at this point, with Sisi's complete control over Egypt, if you did not have that uprising to reflect upon, what would you have? Just a continuous dictatorship from Nasser to the present? What would you do then? Leave alone LGBT, there's nothing. There's not even a breath of fresh air that you can take. I want to go back to your question about Coptic papacy. So the book that I've just finished, on which this paper is based, actually talks precisely about the role of the Coptic Orthodox Church in collaboration with the Egyptian state to create the impasse. So it's not just that the Egyptian state actually has done what it has to contain the minority question, but the minority question as it is understood by Coptic Orthodox Christians, primarily the Coptic Orthodox Church, has come to actually reinforce and reify exactly the same set of problems that the state has produced. So in some sense, you could say that, in fact, the logic and operation of the Coptic Orthodox Church, even as it opposes the Egyptian state for discriminating against Copts, its very actions just basically reflect that very logic and reproduce it. And so, yes, and this is precisely what I mean when I say that religious identity has become more and more reified in the modern period. It has become reified precisely because the different centers of authority that characterized any religious community that have been reduced to that of a representative unit, which in this case is the church. And so one of the attempts of the church, along with the Nasserite regime and the other regimes, was precisely to actually take away the power of secular lay Copts, the secular laity, and to completely take their political and economic power away so that the church is only institution that the state could handle. And then, of course, the church is far more significantly powerful today than it ever was in pre-modern history, which is astonishing.
Talking about hope, I am interested in what's happening in Rojava right now. And Rojava, northern Kurdistan, in northern Syria, they are actually very much interested in these questions, thinking about how a secularism can be, how a political secularism different from a state secularism can be built in a very multi-ethnic place. So I think actually the hope is in the Middle East. First, I just wanted to say that to what Barış was saying. And second, my question is, I remember, for example, in 2006, 7, the European Union was forcing Kurds, not forcing, but suggesting that Kurds should be recognized as a minority in Turkey. And Kurds have vehemently rejected it. They were really angry with that suggestion. And that contributed actually to their rethinking of what they want from the Turkish state, how the constitution can actually address their problems. And they have come with a number of different proposals, and those proposals keep changing. So there is this dialogue going on with, I mean, each ethnic group or each religious group has to come in dialogue with this idea of minority, right? So I am thinking, or I am assuming that in this genealogy, there was a room for those minorities themselves. They were probably, right? They were in dialogue with the European forces, but from, and you didn't talk about that much. So I wanted to hear a little bit what, for example, the Armenians were saying during that time when the concept was being formed, what the Christians were saying, because when you talk about only the European powers, what their plan was, then it sounds, it's almost too national, it fits too much to our nationalist narrative, you know, the capitulations. Yeah, we learn about that in our primary school, and it's the worst awful thing that ever happened to us, and it was all the Europeans who, you know, used the Armenians and all the minorities to get to us.
I'm just reliving your nightmare.
Huh?
I'm reperforming your nightmare, your matchless nightmare.
I mean, of course, I don't mean that, but so we need to hear more what the Armenians wanted, for example. Did they have other kinds of offers? What were they thinking? Because I'm thinking again of Zabel Seyan and what she was writing. She was thinking maybe, I just want to hear more about that.
So yes, I'm sorry I stepped on a nerve here, but let me just say a couple of things regarding your question. The first response I have is that I understand that the nationalist ideology of Turkey reproduces the story of Ottoman sovereignty and how it was challenged by the Europeans and so on and so forth. But I think it's important to rethink that history rather than simply say, listen, we have heard this all our lives, we don't want to hear it again. Because it's precisely because that history has been appropriated in order to construct a nationalist narrative. It needs to be understood on different terms. We need to have a different relationship to our history, despite its appropriation by the state, by the nationalist forces, to give you a canned interpretation of what that was. And for me, even though I'm not from Turkey, but I would dare say that the history of Ottoman Empire was larger than your own, which is why it's not just a nationalist history. It belongs to the rest of the Muslim world as well. And so when I started to read Ottoman history, for me, it was a very instructive moment to try to think about the present. I did not grow up with this reaction. I have my own reactions to Pakistani nationalist historiography. All the Hindus were bad, and they wanted to kill Muslims, and finally we got independence, and hallelujah. So it was, for me, the Ottoman history is really important to think with because it provides a different genealogy for the present of what is happening outside of the frameworks of nationalist historiography, to try to think of what the relationship of Western and non-Western sovereignty is under the shadow of which we live. There are some really interesting legal theorists who have started to think about this. So, for example, against Agamben, who has become the premier theorist of sovereignty and tends to think of sovereignty as a universally available political form that actually becomes globalized, and now we are all living within this globalized world. There are legal theorists who are trying to think of a post-colonial critique of that conception of universal sovereignty. And in particular, I'm thinking of Anthony Angi, and I think it's really important, the argument he makes. He says that the very structure of third world sovereignty, non-Western sovereignty, is a different sovereignty than the one we tend to think of European and North American sovereignty. And to say that this is just simply conceptually the same thing called sovereignty in a Agamben sense, it really is a gross mistake because we do not either conceptually or historically then understand what the nature of the sovereignty is, both conceptually and historically. So I just want to say that, yes, it's the same history, but we have to cultivate a different relationship to that history and interpret it with new eyes. So that's one response. Secondly, yes, you're absolutely right. It's not that Europe was simply able to conquer the Christians of the Middle East. It's not that all Christians just lined up and said, hallelujah, we are going to just really seek protection with Europeans, which is why, for me, Coptic Orthodox Christians are a very interesting example of that they did not do that. They actually refused overtures from Europeans and so on. Now, the options were many for each one of those communities. And in fact, much of the literature on whether it's the Armenian question or, for that matter, in Mount of Lebanon, the Christians, the Maronites, and others who were at the time of part of the Syrian and Lebanese massacre that happened under Ottoman rule, there were many, many different options and many different communities. Ultimately, the plurality of those visions did not win out because of the closure that the violence performed. As the Ottoman state became more and more defensive, it became more and more hostile to its Christian population, which drove them not towards a plurality of vision, but increasingly for survival. And when it becomes a zero-sum game, yes, only hardcore politics wins out. So the responses that these Christian communities had were hijacked and narrowed down by the zero-sum politics of survival, who survives and who does not. And that was actually what I find, again, very interesting about Coptic Orthodox Christians, that their community was never held hostage to that calculus, ever. So and yet, if you look at the history of Coptic Orthodox Christianity, they end up reproducing the very structure of state political rationality. They didn't have to. And they did not actually mirror that in the pre-modern period. So what happens that they end up playing exactly the script that the state wanted them to play, only with higher stakes and worse consequences for the Copts themselves.
Well, thank you. It may be a more personal thing rather than sociological thing, but I observe that as culture and education increases, the belief to be both secular and religious decreases, and people tend to be moving on to more radical ideas about religion. Because most religions suggest a state program, actually. Do you think that without a social engineering, a secular state might really exist with religious beliefs under it?
Can you repeat the last part of your question?
Without social engineering and another perspective that just letting people believe what they believe, can a secular state exist with that way? Because religious beliefs actually propose another state type.
Well, I don't think that the religious movements propose another state type than what the secular state does. All they do is to simply say that we will use the agency of the state to produce a different kind of society. They are just as nationalist. They rely on military force. They rely on violence to be able to institute a vision of the polity. So I think that the problem is precisely in this idea that you can engineer a society through through the agency of the state, whether an intolerant or a tolerant society. And even the goal of producing tolerant society ultimately breeds intolerance, precisely because of the singularity of the vision of the statist projects. We see this over and over again, for example, in Soviet Union. The Soviet Union does not start with the liberal premise. It starts with a very different political imaginary, a Marxist political imaginary. And yet the tendency to actually institute a whole pogrom against its own citizenry that does not toe the line is actually very, very similar results. So I think the idea that religion needs to enter state power in order to become truly religious is a very, very profound mistake. But the critique of it cannot follow, in my opinion, from the secular premise that religion and politics should be kept apart, because religion and politics has never been kept apart in the history, modern history and the secular history. Secular state, your state is an example of it, the secular state continues to manage religious institutions, manage religiosities, produce religiosities, as you say, socially engineer certain forms of religiosities while eradicating the other. So if we are going to actually think about the problem of not reducing religion to state rule, or reducing religion to become another form of statist practice, then I think to go to secularism to think about that is really a dead end. Because and this is precisely why the recent secular studies has been so important, to point historically and empirically to how the secular states operate, is to clearly see that it's not the withdrawal of the modern state from religious life. It is, in fact, its further regulation and its management, which is precisely the first part of my talk, is where I was talking about that.
I'd like to ask the question, since you have mentioned unprecedency and hope, can we say that instead of rooted minority problems of nation states, rather than unprecedented problems such as the flux of Syrian refugees in the region and towards Europe. Could this have a role in rediscussing and transforming the multicultural and multi-religious projects as well as secularism?
That's a really interesting question. So I think the influx of refugees into Europe and then, of course, Turkey is a very, very thorny and complex problem. I wish our leaders were thinking along the lines of your question, which is to say this is an opportunity to rethink the possibility of a multicultural Europe and a multicultural Turkey. I do not see that happening. What I see is an incredible amount of xenophobia that is being leveled at the refugees who are fleeing conditions of civil warfare. What I find very, very appalling is that the United States government is responsible for waging war in the Middle East and creating conditions of immense violence, chaos, and anarchy, and yet there is no discussion whether Americans should absorb the refugees who are coming from this region. They are the ones who oversaw this war. They are the ones who created havoc. They are the ones who marshaled the energies of European governments to support their agenda. And of course, the United Nations approved that. And yet, what is the discussion? There is no discussion in America about absorption there is no moral responsibility, there's no political responsibility, there's no ethical responsibility. We have election debates that are going on. Not one single political candidate has mentioned either the travesty that the Iraq War was, or what responsibility do they have to absorb the refugees who are fleeing from Iraq, from Libya, and from Syria, and now, of course, Yemen, after our favorite ally, America's favorite ally, Saudi Arabia, has bombed that to smithereens. So I just want to note that now as to Europe, Western Europe has had to deal with that because, of course, the refugees are at their borders. And I think it's extremely ironic that Merkel has come to Turkey to ask your government to actually seal off the borders and is willing to pay a small cost for it. What's ironic is that the discussion is not about what the future of these refugees is going to be in Turkey. There is no investment in thinking of how they're going to be integrated, what their life is going to be like. Are they going to become productive citizens? Is there going to be services, refugee services, immigration services, on all the rest of the things that you need in order to make a second life possible? That's not on the table. What's on the table is, please seal these borders so that they don't come into Germany. To me, that is not exactly thinking of multicultural Europe.
I just want to add that I've seen the protests of European people in the streets demanding their governments to accept more refugees. And yes, I was going to add, Merkel was here yesterday. And I guess it was Macedonia that they told that we can only accept Christian Syrian refugees since we don't have mosques here. And I was going to say that the state and the people are not on the same page here. And can we say that there is a hope of rediscussing it? I was just thinking about that.
Is there hope? Yes, well, I think it's precisely those kinds of citizen actions, right, against the governments themselves to say, you know, and I agree with you. I was very pleasantly surprised, and I followed some of those responses of pockets of citizens, because there is also incredible racism, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim racism in Europe, and having lived in Germany for a while, you come across it all the time. There's this sense that there is, you know, our country is being invaded. So yes, but those kinds of actions are indeed very, very hopeful. Absolutely. But it's interesting to me that every single instance of hope that we have just mentioned is always the sporadic actions, spontaneous actions of people rising up and saying, enough, we will not accept this in the name of the state. Maybe there is hope. Sure.
Thank you for your talk. If I understood you correctly, you said that it's naive and downright wrong to expect from the secular state to resolve any tensions between the minority and the majority, since the secular state is itself implicated in the creation of these problems. So, am thinking if it's not, and I don't think that there's any doubt in the minds of people here in relation to Turkey that the secular state is implicated in the problems between the majority and the minority. I think that's quite clear in the context of Turkey. So, and we also said that we see kind of these spurs of hope. But if those spurs of hope are not going to get into a dialogue with this secular state in terms of any expectations, what is the nature of that dialogue? Are we supposed to leave the state out of the equation altogether? Because I don't see that that's a practical solution. So if we're supposed to carry out a conversation with the state, what is the nature of that conversation? How do you foresee that happening?
That's a great question. First of all, I did not say that it as a downright wrong. I think I wouldn't use that word, it's downright wrong too, because for the simple reason that indeed state policy remains a very important vector of any kind of political action. Absolutely, of course, taking on state policy is one of the primary ways through which to think, to challenge the status quo and to change the facts on the ground. What I was pointing to is a paradox, right? And a paradox doesn't make life still or close the horizon of action. Paradox means that there is a profoundly contradictory impetus that drives the synergy and the force of a certain formation. You know, analytical philosophers thought that if you had a paradox, then everything was ended and you had to start from scratch. Much of other kind of political philosophy has taught us that paradoxes are actually very generative. So when I was talking about the paradox that we turn to the very state that has actually created the problem, I'm trying to get us to critically think about what kind of political action would we need to take. Can we actually pin our hopes on the fact that if it was a truly secular state, then it would be more tolerant? I would say likely not. Now, that doesn't mean that, of course, the repressive policies of the state towards its minorities should be just simply that form of political action be abandoned. I mean, in Turkey, you are going through this right now, you know, the HDP party and all that my friends have been telling me. I have just started to learn about this. It's not that that is the hope. It's not going to deliver the crisis from Turkey, for Turkey. But what is important here is to realize that there is actually a political attempt to think across those lines of difference. And of course, it's working within the political system. But I think what I'm also trying to say is to just simply think of politics as that of seizing the state, or simply thinking that a different model of the state is going to create the solution. I think that is where I find, as where I sit, my political imagination, my political efforts are just simply get paralyzed when I don't think of the agency of the state. And I think that's a collective problem. And that is a problem we have to think with.